You're born in a sterile hospital room under fluorescent lights, and the moment you take your first breath, reality shifts around you in some small or catastrophic way that marks you as different from every other human who has ever lived. Maybe the lights flicker and die permanently, never to work again in your presence. Maybe you suddenly weigh 3 times what a newborn should, your tiny body impossibly dense. Maybe you can hear every conversation happening within a mile radius, a cacophony of voices flooding your infant brain. Your parents don't know what your power is yet. Nobody does, because powers manifest differently for everyone and reveal themselves on their own timeline, sometimes in the delivery room, sometimes years later, during a moment of stress or boredom or joy. But they know with absolute certainty that you have one, because every human born in the last 50 years has emerged into the world carrying a single superhuman ability, a violation of natural law unique to them, randomly assigned by whatever cosmic mechanism triggered this transformation of our species. Some people can fly. Others can only make pencils slightly damp. One person in 7 billion can reshape matter with their thoughts. Another can perfectly predict what someone will have for breakfast 3 days from now. The distribution is entirely random, unconnected to genetics or environment or merit or need. A lottery where everyone gets a ticket, but most people win something useless or actively detrimental, while a tiny fraction receive abilities that remake the world around them. This is Earth now, 50 years after the change, and nothing about human civilization looks the way it did before, because when everyone is super, nobody is, but also somehow everybody still is, and navigating that paradox has torn society apart and rebuilt it in forms stranger than any science fiction writer ever imagined. Let's walk through this transformed world and understand what happens when supernatural ability becomes universal, but usefulness remains desperately rare. The first and most important thing to understand is that the powers aren't magic. They're physics violations, which sounds like a distinction without a difference until you really think about what it means. When someone with super strength lifts a car, the energy has to come from somewhere. Their body is somehow extracting energy from their environment or from their own mass in ways that violate conservation of energy. But the violation is consistent and reproducible, following rules even if we don't understand what those rules are. Scientists in this world have spent 5 decades trying to figure out the mechanism behind powers, running thousands of experiments, studying brain scans and genetic sequences and quantum field measurements around powered individuals, and they've learned absolutely nothing useful. The powers don't correlate with anything measurable in biology or physics. Identical twins separated at birth develop completely different abilities with no predictive pattern. Brain activity during power use looks completely normal except for microsecond-scale anomalies that vanish before instruments can capture meaningful data. The leading theory, which isn't really a theory so much as an admission of ignorance dressed in scientific language, is that powers represent localized alterations to physical law itself, tiny bubbles where the universe runs on different rules, centered on individual human beings for reasons unknown. This means you can't replicate powers, can't transfer them, can't enhance or suppress them beyond the natural limits each person discovers through trial and error. You're born with what you're born with, and that's your reality forever. The power distribution follows something eerily close to a power law, which is probably the cruelest mathematical joke the universe has ever played on humanity. Roughly 80% of people have powers so minor or so useless that they might as well not have them at all. These are the people who can change the color of their left thumbnail at will, who can make small rocks slightly warmer by concentrating, who have perfect pitch but only for the note F sharp, who can teleport exactly 3 inches to the left once per day. Their lives are essentially normal, except for this weird quirk they carry around, a cosmic reminder that they participated in the lottery but didn't win anything meaningful. Another 15% have powers that are noticeable and sometimes useful, but not life-changing. They can run twice as fast as a normal human, but not faster than a car. They can see in the dark, but only in shades of gray. They can heal small cuts in minutes instead of days. These people have advantages in certain situations, but they're not superheroes in any meaningful sense. They're just people with a useful skill, like being naturally good at math or having perfect vision. Then you get to the top 5%, and this is where things get interesting and dangerous, because these are the people whose powers actually matter, who can affect the world in ways that normal humans cannot counter or compete with, whose very existence changes the fundamental power dynamics of society. Imagine being born with the ability to fly, real flight, not just jumping high or gliding, but actual controlled movement through three-dimensional space at speeds up to 100 miles per hour. You're suddenly the fastest transportation on the planet for individual travel. Military forces want to recruit you. Delivery companies offer you enormous salaries. Governments track your movements because unregulated flight is a security nightmare. Or imagine you can read minds within a 100-foot radius. Not vague impressions, but clear verbal thoughts. Every person around you broadcasting their inner monologue directly into your consciousness, whether you want to hear it or not. You become simultaneously the most valuable interrogator on Earth and a social pariah, because nobody can trust that their secrets are safe around you. Friendship becomes impossible when privacy doesn't exist. Or maybe you got the ability to generate electrical fields strong enough to power a city block, which makes you incredibly valuable to power companies, but also means you can never turn it off completely. Electronics fail in your presence. You can't touch another person without shocking them. Isolation becomes your permanent state. The top 5% live in a completely different reality than everyone else. Their powers so significant that normal social rules don't apply to them anymore. And society has fractured trying to figure out how to accommodate them, control them, or defend against them. Then there's the top 1%, the people who won the cosmic lottery so completely that they're essentially gods walking among mortals. And this is where civilization starts breaking down, because there's no institutional framework that can contain or compete with someone who can, say, teleport anywhere on Earth instantaneously, or become completely invulnerable to all damage, or control the weather in a 1,000-mile radius. These individuals, probably numbering somewhere around 80 million globally, are walking catastrophes or saviors depending on their personality and choices. And humanity has discovered the hard way that personality and moral character are completely uncorrelated with power level. Some of the most powerful individuals are kind and thoughtful, using their abilities to help others and trying to integrate into society despite their godlike capabilities. Others are selfish or cruel or simply indifferent, treating normal humans as irrelevant obstacles. And there's often nothing anyone can do to stop them, because conventional weapons and tactics are useless against someone who can disintegrate matter by looking at it, or who regenerates from any injury in seconds. The first 2 decades after the change were marked by what historians now call the chaos period, when newly powered individuals tested their abilities. Some became warlords, carving out territories. Others became heroes, defending the powerless, and governments collapsed or transformed as they realized their monopoly on violence had evaporated overnight. Education transformed completely, because when every child has a unique ability, the old model of standardized instruction becomes useless. Schools now are more like power discovery and management centers, institutions where children learn to identify what their ability is, understand its limits and applications, and figure out how to live with it. For the 80% with useless powers, this is a brief and often humiliating process. Discovering that your special gift is the ability to make flowers wilt slightly faster feels like cosmic mockery, a reminder that you're technically special but practically worthless. For the middle tier, education becomes vocational training, matching powers to careers. If you can breathe underwater, you're steered toward marine biology or salvage diving. If you can see electromagnetic fields, you're recruited into electrical engineering. But for the powerful, education is part training, part containment, part negotiation. A child who can cause earthquakes by screaming needs to learn control before they accidentally level a city. A teenager who can phase through solid matter needs to understand that walking through bank vaults is theft, regardless of how easy it is for them. The education system has become part therapeutic, part prison, trying to socialize individuals who have the power to reject socialization entirely. And the success rate is, let's say, inconsistent. The economy has reorganized itself around power utility in ways that would be fascinating if they weren't so dystopian. There's now a formal power rating system, a standardized assessment that everyone undergoes around age 18, where experts evaluate your ability and assign it a market value based on its usefulness, reliability, and scarcity. Someone with telekinesis might be rated at 9 out of 10 if they can manipulate objects weighing several tons, while someone who can only move paperclips scores a 3. Your rating determines your entire economic prospects. High-rated individuals receive recruitment offers from corporations and governments before they finish school, their powers making them more valuable than any skill or education they could acquire. Low-rated individuals face a labor market that has collapsed for ordinary humans. Why hire someone to do construction when you can hire a single individual who can lift steel beams with their mind and do the work of 20 normal people? This has created a permanent underclass of the barely powered or usefully powered, people whose abilities are too minor to command high salaries, but who still technically have powers. So they can't even claim the sympathy sometimes extended to the truly powerless. And yes, there are still some people born without powers. About 1 in every 1,000 births produces a completely normal human, and these individuals occupy a strange space in society, sometimes pitied, sometimes envied, definitely discriminated against, because the assumption is that if you don't have a power, you can't compete or contribute in meaningful ways. Relationships and reproduction have become genetic roulette with nightmare implications. Powers don't breed true. 2 parents who can fly might produce a child who can only sneeze glitter, and 2 parents with useless abilities might randomly produce a child who can control minds, which creates fascinating and terrible dynamics in family structures. Some couples choose not to have children because they're terrified of producing a child whose power is so dangerous that they can't control them, or so tragic that the child suffers their entire life. Others become obsessed with reproduction, having as many children as possible, hoping that one will win the power lottery and elevate the family's status. There's a black market in genetic counseling services that claim to predict power manifestation, all of them fraudulent because no genetic or environmental factors have ever been shown to influence power expression. But desperate people will believe anything that offers control over the uncontrollable. Relationships between people of vastly different power levels are fraught with imbalances that go beyond normal human inequality. Imagine being married to someone who can read your thoughts, or dating someone who could accidentally kill you with a touch, or raising a child who is functionally immortal and will outlive you by centuries. The normal complexities of human intimacy are magnified 1,000-fold when supernatural ability enters the equation. Crime has entered a bizarre arms race where the advantage shifts constantly depending on who has what power. Traditional law enforcement collapsed early in the change. Police armed with guns and training meant nothing against someone who could teleport away from arrest, or who was bulletproof, or who could make themselves invisible. This forced the development of new policing paradigms. Governments now recruit high-powered individuals specifically for law enforcement, creating what are essentially state-sanctioned superhero teams whose job is to counter criminal-powered individuals. But this only works as long as the most powerful people choose to work for governments rather than against them. And that choice is maintained through a combination of high salaries, legal protections, and the implicit threat that if you don't cooperate, even more powerful individuals will be sent to deal with you. Some nations have achieved a relatively stable order where powered law enforcement roughly balances powered crime. Others have descended into failed state status, controlled by warlords with combat-useful powers who've established territories that governments can't reclaim without starting wars that would devastate everything around them. The global map now includes several dozen unofficial nations, regions controlled by individuals or small groups whose powers make them effectively sovereign. And international law has had to adapt to recognize that sovereignty sometimes comes from individual capability rather than state apparatus. Medicine and healthcare face paradoxes that would be darkly funny if they weren't so serious. About 1 in every 100,000 people has a healing power of some kind, ranging from the ability to cure minor injuries by touch to full regeneration of lost limbs and organs, even resurrection from death if the body is mostly intact. These healers are literally worth their weight in diamonds. They're the most sought-after individuals on the planet, offered absurd wealth and protection in exchange for their services. But there aren't enough healers to treat everyone who needs treatment, not even close, which has created a two-tier medical system more brutal than anything that existed before powers. If you're wealthy, or important, or lucky enough to live near a healer who takes charity cases, you have access to medical care that borders on miraculous. Conditions that would have been death sentences in the old world are now complete recoveries in minutes. If you're not, you rely on conventional medicine that looks increasingly primitive compared to what healing powers can accomplish. And you watch people with the same conditions as you get cured instantly, while you suffer through the old, slow, expensive methods. Some healers try to help as many people as possible, working themselves to exhaustion healing strangers, but they burn out or get kidnapped by organizations that want exclusive access to their abilities. Others charge market rates for their services, becoming billionaires by age 25, and society can't decide if they're heroes monetizing their gifts or monsters who found a way to profit from suffering. The philosophical and religious implications have torn apart every major belief system and created dozens of new ones. Traditional religions struggled to explain why God or the universe would randomly distribute supernatural abilities with no apparent moral logic. Why a saint might get the power to make puddles evaporate while a serial killer gets invulnerability. Some religious communities interpreted powers as divine gifts or tests, developing elaborate theological frameworks to explain who gets what and why, usually concluding that power level reflects spiritual worthiness despite all evidence to the contrary. Others declared powers demonic, a corruption of natural law, and formed movements dedicated to suppressing or abstaining from power use, with varying levels of success, given that you can't really choose not to be invulnerable or choose not to hear thoughts if that's your ability. New religions emerged specifically around powers, cults forming around the most powerful individuals, treating them as gods or prophets, and in some cases, those individuals leaning into the worship, establishing theocracies where their word is literal law because they have the power to enforce it. Secular philosophy hasn't fared much better. The concept of human equality became obviously false when some humans can reshape reality and others can barely tie their shoes, forcing complete reconsideration of ethics and rights and justice when the fundamental assumption that all humans have roughly equal capability is shattered. Art and culture have exploded in strange directions because some powers are fundamentally creative in ways that open entirely new artistic mediums. There are sculptors who shape stone with their minds, creating works of impossible delicacy and scale that no tool could produce. Musicians who can generate sounds that don't exist in normal physics, tones and harmonies that affect emotions directly. Painters who work with light itself, creating images that hang in the air and shift based on the viewer's perspective. These artists command enormous respect and commercial success because they're producing art that literally cannot be created any other way. Uniqueness guaranteed by the singular nature of their abilities. But there's also resentment and debate about whether power-assisted art is really art or just spectacle, whether skill matters when reality bends to your will, whether beauty created effortlessly through supernatural means carries the same value as beauty painstakingly crafted through human technique. The debate has never been resolved and probably never will be, because at its core, it's asking whether the value of creation comes from the result or the process, and powers have decoupled those in ways that make answering impossible. Sports fractured into so many specialized categories that following them all is a full-time job. There's traditional sports for the unpowered and barely powered, where athletes compete under roughly equal conditions, like in the old world. Then there's power-assisted sports, where participants can use their abilities, but competition is still theoretically fair, because you're only competing against others with similar power levels. Strength-based powers compete in strength events, speed-based in speed events, and so on. Then there's unlimited sports, pure spectacle, where the most powerful individuals demonstrate capabilities that make traditional athletics look like children's games. People flying at supersonic speeds through obstacle courses, manipulating fire and ice in combat arenas, lifting buildings in strength competitions. The ratings for unlimited sports are enormous because people love watching the impossible. but there's something hollow about it too. It's not really competition when outcomes are determined by what power you were randomly assigned at birth, rather than by training or strategy or heart. The athletes themselves often seem bored, going through motions of contests where they have no real peers, performing for crowds who will never understand what it's like to possess their abilities. Warfare between nations has become unthinkably destructive in some contexts and completely pointless in others. If two nations each have access to multiple individuals with city-destroying powers, actual war becomes mutually assured destruction. Neither side can attack without triggering retaliation that would devastate them just as badly. This has created a strange stability between major powers, Cold War logic extended to its ultimate conclusion, where the weapons are people, and the deterrent is the knowledge that for every powered individual you deploy, your enemy will deploy theirs. But asymmetric conflicts are nightmare scenarios. A single sufficiently powerful individual can destabilize entire regions, walking into capitals and demanding surrender, destroying military infrastructure faster than it can be rebuilt. And conventional forces are useless to stop them unless you have powered individuals of your own to deploy in response. Some nations have invested everything into recruiting and retaining high-powered citizens, offering them extraordinary privileges and protection in exchange for military service. Others have collapsed entirely, unable to compete in a world where national power is increasingly determined by who won the genetic lottery rather than by industrial capacity or economic strength or popular will. The space program has advanced further in 50 years than it did in the previous century of conventional rockets, because a small percentage of powers involve resistance to vacuum, radiation, cold, or the ability to survive without oxygen, and those individuals can work in space using nothing but their innate abilities. There are construction workers building orbital stations who simply float up to the work site, spend 8 hours in vacuum without protection, then come back down at the end of their shift. There are prospectors mining asteroids, teleporting between Earth and the belt, bringing back loads of rare metals that would have required billion-dollar missions in the old world. But space access is still limited to those few individuals whose powers happen to be useful in vacuum, creating another inequality where cosmic resources are available only to a tiny elite who won the right power lottery, while everyone else watches from Earth's surface, knowing they'll never participate in humanity's expansion beyond the planet. Some futurists predict that eventually the powered will abandon Earth entirely, heading into space to establish colonies where they don't have to deal with the resentment and limitations of living among the mostly powerless, creating a permanent split in the human species between those who stay and those who leave. The question of whether powers can be lost or changed haunts every powered individual, because there are documented cases of people's abilities shifting, usually in response to trauma or extreme stress. Someone who could create fire suddenly finds they can only create cold. Someone who could fly loses the ability permanently after a near-death experience. The mechanism is unknown. The frequency is low enough that most people never experience it, but the possibility terrifies everyone, particularly those whose entire lives are built around their abilities. Imagine being a professional healer, earning millions per year, your identity and livelihood completely tied to your gift, and then one day you wake up and it's gone, and you're just a normal human with no marketable skills because you never needed to develop any. Or worse, Imagine your power changes to something harmful. Someone who could generate pleasant sounds, suddenly producing deafening noise they can't control. Forced into isolation, or having to wear suppression equipment that barely works. The uncertainty adds another layer of anxiety to existence in this world. Not only do you have to live with whatever random ability you were assigned, you have to live with the knowledge that it might disappear or transform into something worse at any moment. Children growing up in this world internalize power dynamics so early that it shapes their entire psychology. By age 5, kids in schools have already sorted themselves into informal hierarchies based on whose powers are impressive and whose are embarrassing. The child who can make small illusions is popular, entertaining classmates during free time. The child who involuntarily generates bad smells is isolated, treated as defective, even though they have as much control over their power as anyone else. Teachers try to instill values of equality and respect, but it rings hollow when some children are objectively more capable than others in ways that cannot be changed through effort or education. Bullying takes on supernatural dimensions. A child with enhanced strength can literally crush another child. A child with mental powers can make another child's life psychological torture. And stopping it requires having powered staff on hand at all times. Teachers selected partially for their ability to counter aggressive uses of student powers. Growing up in this environment creates adults who view hierarchy as natural and inevitable, who assume that power level determines worth, who have internalized the lottery logic so deeply that they can't imagine alternative ways of organizing society. The psychological damage is probably incalculable, but there's no baseline to compare it to. Everyone under 50 has lived their entire life in the powered world, and there's no going back to what we were before. Suicide rates are 5 times higher than in the pre-change world, and the reasons are complex but traceable to the unique pressures of random power distribution. People with devastating powers they can't control often choose death over continuing to harm others accidentally. Someone whose presence causes plants to die, or whose touch inflicts pain, has to watch themselves damage everything around them without intention or ability to stop. People with amazing powers sometimes crack under the pressure of constant demands on their time and energy. Healers in particular often choose suicide after years of being begged for help they can't provide to everyone who needs it. The weight of all that suffering they could theoretically address, but practically cannot becoming unbearable. And people with useless powers sometimes despair at the cosmic joke of being technically super, but practically ordinary. The cruelty of being included in the lottery, but given nothing of value, driving them to conclude that existence in a world that constantly reminds them they're inadequate isn't worth continuing. Society has tried to address this with support systems and therapy and medication, but ultimately, there's no real solution to the problem that some people drew terrible hands in a game they never asked to play and cannot leave. And yet, somehow, most people find ways to live, to build relationships, and pursue happiness and create meaning despite the absolute chaos of this reality. Communities form around shared experiences, support groups for people with similar powers or similar struggles, friendships between individuals who understand each other's unique situations in ways that broader society cannot. Love still happens. People still fall for each other despite or because of their abilities, finding ways to navigate the complications and imbalances that powers introduce into intimacy. Children are still born and raised with hope that maybe their lives will be better than their parents, that maybe they'll draw a good power, or if not, that they'll find a way to build a worthwhile existence anyway. Humans are remarkably resilient. We've survived and adapted to every environment Earth can throw at us. And apparently, we can survive and adapt to this too. A world where the rules changed overnight and the universe decided to run a massive experiment on what happens when you give everyone something special, but make most of those somethings worthless. The civilization we've built is stranger, more fractured, more unequal than anything that existed before, but it's still recognizably human, still full of people trying to figure out how to live well and treat each other decently and find purpose in whatever circumstances they've been given. So we return to that hospital room where you took your first breath and reality shifted in some small or large way that marked you forever. 50 years later, you're still figuring out what your power means, what you can do with it, how it shapes your identity and your possibilities and your limitations. Maybe you won the lottery. Maybe you're one of the lucky few whose ability is genuinely useful and valuable, and you've built a life of privilege and influence that would have been impossible in the old world. Maybe you drew something useless or harmful, and you've spent your whole life figuring out how to live around this thing you carry that you never wanted and cannot change. Maybe you're somewhere in between. Your power is interesting, but not life-changing. A quirk you've learned to incorporate into your identity without letting it define you completely. But regardless of what you got, you share something with every other person born in the last 5 decades. The knowledge that you're simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. Part of a species where everyone is special. But that specialness is distributed so randomly and so unequally that it often feels like no one is special at all. The universe gave humanity a gift, or maybe a curse, or maybe just a challenge. 7 billion experiments in what happens when you take the superhero fantasy and make it universal, but strip away the narrative convenience that makes comic books satisfying. The results are messy and complicated and often unfair in ways that can't be fixed, but they're also real and lived in and human in all the ways that matter. We're not better than we were before the change, not morally or socially or in any of the ways we hoped gaining powers would make us better. But we're also not worse, not fundamentally. We're just us. Humanity, with all its beauty and cruelty and creativity and short-sightedness, now equipped with abilities that make all of those qualities more visible and consequential than they ever were before. And if there's a lesson in that, it's probably that what matters isn't what capabilities you have, but what you choose to do with them. A truth that was always there, but that powers have made impossible to ignore. The lottery continues. Children born every day, receiving their random gifts. And all we can do is help each other navigate the beautiful, terrible mess we've been given, one power at a time.